Check, check, mic check. Check, check, mic check. Welcome to Podcast Envy. I'm your podcast boss, Andrea Klunder, and this is the show where we are curating the craft and culture of podcasting so you can make a show that is the envy of everyone else. I say that tongue-in-cheek because what we really want is a show that matters, that challenges the status quo, that changes something for our listeners. I've started calling this a show of significance. What do you think? Does that sound right to you? A show of significance. I mean, this drive, this fire, this lofty idealism is often at the very heart of why we start a podcast in the first place, right? And today's guest is no different. Lori L. Tharps created My American Meltingpot in 2018 as an extension of her blog by the same name to talk about race and real life. Well, let Lori tell you herself. Lori Tharps, thank you so much for joining me for Podcast Envy.
Thank you for having me.
Let's talk a little bit about what you create, your content. And obviously, I am partial to podcasting. So let's talk about My American Melting Pot a little bit. You have been podcasting for a while. You are not new to podcasting.
I feel new.
You still feel new.
It still feels new, but I started at the end of 2018, and I have been blogging since the olden days. I've been blogging for more than 13 years. And in 2018, I said I was going to relaunch my blog. It has the same name, My American Melting Pot. And it's always been a blog where I have been kind of keeping track of cultural collisions and collaborations. I just love to talk about where different cultures meet up, right? And often that was just kind of things coming out of my mind. When I was first blogging, I wrote a lot about my family and parenting because I'm African American and my husband is from Spain. And so raising 2 and then 3 biracial, bicultural, bilingual children often gave me lots to write about. So when I relaunched the blog in 2018, I wanted to make it more public facing and less about my personal life and more about kind of commenting on what was happening in the world as it related to multicultural living, if you will. And one of my students, I'm a professor of journalism at Temple University. One of my students told me, you have to have a podcast. And I was like, what? What is a podcast?
A side note, I'm laughing in this clip because I also was once told by a student, a yoga student to be exact, when I had my own yoga studio business, that I should start a podcast. That was in 2012. And at that time, I had exactly the same reaction as Lori. What's a podcast?
She was telling me that she listened to all these podcasts and I really should do it. And I said, okay, but I had no idea what it was. But when I made my little, when I say business plan, there's gigantic air quotes around that. But what I was going to try to do with My American Melting Pot. And so this was, let's say, in January of 2018, I registered for Podcast Movement, which I'm sure you know is a big podcast conference. Yeah. It was going to be in Philadelphia that year, which is where I'm based. And I thought, I'll go there because I'll have my podcast already launched and I'll just, it'll be great.
Well, yes, in fact, I do know Podcast Movement. I haven't missed a year since the first time I attended in Chicago. Philadelphia was the year that I actually was a featured speaker. So Lori and I must have narrowly missed each other many times. I never actually thought to invest in attending a conference until I had already been podcasting for a few years. And even then, I had major imposter syndrome. But wow, is it a great way to kickstart some momentum for a new podcaster or even reignite a long-running show?
So I registered and paid the money. And then a month before, I hadn't even thought about my podcast. And I was like, I'm not going to this convention. I don't even know what I'm doing. But I'd paid already. So I went, got excited and inspired. I convinced the radio station at my university to allow me to record there. So I didn't have to do all the technology, which is the part that scared me and made me think I couldn't do it.
Check that box. Lori found a way to clear one of the biggest obstacles most new podcasters face, the tech.
And I hired an editor to edit the podcast. So literally, I just showed up in the studio. I did all the production, though. I created the concept. I arranged all the interviews and I edited. I didn't do the actual editing on the screen, but, edited the podcast how I wanted it to sound.
And check again. Editing. Another big time suck and source of so much frustration and heartache for many podcasters. Lori found someone right away who could work with her on this important aspect of the show so she could focus on what she does best, creating the narrative.
Anyway, all that to say, the podcast was it was a podcast version of the blog. The tagline was, we tell stories and have conversations about the intersection of race and real life. Because I really believe that people get nervous about race because they think of it as, this big kind of overarching, insurmountable problem, where I think of it as hairstyles and the way you eat Thanksgiving, like what's on your Thanksgiving dinner table and what music you listen to, and the fact that, Black kids and Latino kids are listening to K-pop. Isn't that cool? I think of race as something that really just intersects with everything that we do. And if we could talk about it the way we talk about food and music and fashion, then we would have a much better time at figuring out how to kind of get rid of racism, if you will. So that's what the podcast really was about. And I'm like one of those people who just keeps trying new things in a way. I did the Don't Be Racist series.
The Don't Be Racist series is a handful of short, direct, stunning episodes of My American Meltingpot. I mean stunning in a great way. I devoured this series in September and October of 2020, and that is actually what inspired me to invite Lori onto my other show, The Creative Imposter, to talk about the concept of anti-racism as self-care. Make a note, you want to listen to that conversation, so add episode 130 of The Creative Imposter to your listening queue for right after this one.
I was so appalled by the murder of George Floyd. I was distressed by the 2016 and 2020 elections that I felt like I have this platform. I don't have a large audience, but I have a platform and I need to use my voice to help. And that's always been my agenda as a writer, as a journalist, as a blogger. Like, I want to tell stories. I want to use my voice. I want to use my words to make this world a better place, which sounds so basic, but that's really my impetus for doing what I do. And so sometimes I'd get tired, so I would try to do shorter episodes or just try to squeak in a little this or a little that. I did an audio memoir when I was in Spain, I guess 2 summers ago, which was like a follow-up of my memoir, Kinky Gazpacho. I did a kind of a 10-year update, but as audio instead of written, which was really exciting, which is great when you work at a university because you can use their equipment.
Yes.
And took that to Spain with me, and it was just fantastic. So basically, like, learning as I go, but just keeping the conversation going about race and culture in America and trying to do it in a way that is accessible to all people.
This is one of the places that podcasters can get stuck. You have a brilliant idea for a show. You launch, you release 6, 7, 10, 15, even 50 episodes, and then you hit a wall. You fall out of love with your show. Maybe you've run out of episode ideas or potential guests. Maybe you're short on time or energy due to the 10,000 other things in your life and work. Maybe the topic no longer feels relevant to you, or maybe you're just bored. This is when it's time to mix it up. Try a new format, shorter episodes, longer episodes, a theme, a series, new guests, no guests, a guest host. Lori has been open to experiment with her show, to follow her curiosity, and all the while, this is key, keep her listener and her purpose of, quote, keeping the conversation going about race and culture in America and trying to do it in a way that is accessible, end quote, at the center. You've written a lot about your experience in relation to race, and you have a podcast in which you're talking about multiculturalism, you're talking about anti-racism. Do you just sometimes feel like you want to talk about anything else, that you are just so tired of talking about race?
Yes, that's exactly it. I want to talk about happy things. And the thing is, like, I made my vision board for 2021, and like joy was one of the big words on it. Like I said, that I want to be a part of the solution. I want to be an anti-racist activist, but I want to use celebration as a form of protest. And I want to, instead of highlighting the problems, I want to highlight the solutions. I want to show people what's possible by showing them, like, look at this amazing, like, for example, there's a new publisher, a new imprint that's coming out that is going to be all YA romance stories with multicultural characters. Hello.
Oh, yeah.
So amazing. Like, rather than let's have another story about the lack of diversity in literature for young people, why not talk about this Black woman and her Asian husband, who are both very successful writers, are going to start their own imprint where they're commissioning romance novels for young people of color.
And now it's time to give thanks to our podcast angels, those companies who provide products, services, and resources that help make our podcasting journey oh so sweet, and who support Podcast Envy and the Creative Imposter Studios along the way. Today, I'm shouting out Mighty Networks. Facebook groups are so 2020. Let's move into a fresh era of what online community building can be. Mighty Networks is where I host the Creative Imposter Collective in an aesthetically pleasing, ad-free space that isn't tracking your every online move. What's the Creative Imposter Collective, you say? Well, it's a totally free online community of creative folks centering the experience of women, sharing the intersection of creativity and identity through weekly Zoom sessions where we dish about what's good and get off our chest what isn't, and support each other along the way. It's totally free to join. Oh, and if you're thinking it would be amazing to have a curated group of creative folks like that to talk specifically about the craft and culture of podcasting, funny you should say that because that's what I want to create next. I've started a waitlist for a premium private network called the Craft and Culture Club. If and when I have enough culturally curious podcasting folk on that list, I'll send details and invitations to join. Zooming back out, if you want to start an online community for your podcast audience, either as a free space to connect or as a premium membership-based offering, you can check out Mighty Networks for yourself. Follow my link in the show notes so they know I sent ya. Links for the Creative Imposter Collective and Craft and Culture Club waitlist will be there for you as well in the episode description in your app. And where do you see the podcast going next?
Well, I'm so glad you asked me that because it's a matter of fact, 2020 was such a traumatic experience for all of us, right? I had to do a lot of soul searching. Like, I was supposed to be in Spain this whole year of 2020. I was supposed to be on sabbatical in Spain, writing a book about Spain. And that didn't happen thanks to the pandemic. And so I think I mean, I don't want to get too deep and philosophical, but
go for it.
The pandemic for me really made me have to reevaluate what was important in life, what I want to do with my life. I'm going to be 50 in a couple of years, and I think of this as like a turning point. A very good friend of mine died last week, not from COVID. It was like a heart attack, and he wasn't much older than myself. And so I really had this, it's been brewing, like, you don't have two lives, you only have one. And what are the things that make you the most happy? And so I love doing my podcast, but it stresses me out. Like, it just stresses me out because of all of the like I have all these ideas of what I want to do and how I want to do it. And really, I just like talking to people. And what I like talking about more than anything are books. I'm the most boring writer in the world because I love writing and I love reading. And if you ask me what I wanted to talk about all the time, it would be books, bookstores, libraries, just books. Like, I love reading and writing. And so I am completely pivoting the Melting Pot. I'm not changing the name. I love the race and culture aspect of what I do. So, the focus is now going to be on multicultural books and the people who write and love them, the people who write and read them, basically. So it's going to be a combination of, I shouldn't say combination, it really is just going to be a kind of a literary love fest for multicultural stories. And
I hope you're using that as your
first.
tagline, a literary love fest for multicultural stories. That is really good.
I got to write that down. That was good.
That's really good. That's how you know a writer is when she writes while she's speaking and she doesn't even know that she's doing it.
Yes. Seriously, you're the first. I've said it out loud to you. So this is like an exclusive.
You heard it here first, folks.
There you go.
Lori is brilliantly modeling what it takes to be a podcaster with longevity, one who knows that your show can and should grow and change along with you. When she described this new reimagining of My American Meltingpot to me back in January of 2021, after a long, deep conversation about racism and embracing anti-racist work for the creative imposter, it just felt so light and joyful and right. And to me, it sounded like a journey that her core listeners would definitely follow her on. And soon after our conversation, she made an announcement about the shift in the direction, changed the tagline for the show as discussed, and released 10 incredible episodes with multicultural authors. But then, a surprise. In mid-April, Lori announced that she had decided that My American Meltingpot had reached its natural conclusion. And after 3 years and 6 seasons, she'd be retiring the show. But don't worry, the feed isn't going anywhere. So all of her past episodes are still there for you to binge, including the multicultural author interviews, the Don't Be Racist series, and so much more. And even better, dun 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 dun, a new podcast is being incubated right now, a podcast spinoff, if you will, Melting Pot Stories, casting an even wider lens on multicultural books and storytelling as Lori moves her family to Spain, where her husband is originally from. Believe me, I know it is not easy to let go of something you have poured your heart and soul and many hours of work into, but for Lori, this feels like exactly the right move. Lori, is there anything else that you want to share with our listeners who are podcast creators and in some cases podcast dreamers, pod dreamers as I call them, who haven't maybe yet started their show? What would you like to leave our podcasters and pod dreamers with?
I think that podcasting is still such a new enterprise that whatever you want to do, I mean, I'm saying this because I need to hear this myself, but whatever you want to do, like there are no rules. Like there are literally no rules. So if you need to break the rules, go ahead and break them. Do what you want to do. The most successful podcasts, seriously, you're like, when you hear about podcasters or podcasts that are successful, you're like, how did that happen? And why is that popular? And it's not worth trying to copy anybody. Do what you want to do, what you love. One, because podcasting takes a lot of work. And if you're not loving it, it's not going to last. So do something you genuinely love that you won't mind, editing it 7 more times or re-recording it because you accidentally forgot to hit record. All of these things that can happen. It really must be something you love because it is a lot more work than I think people assume. So give yourself that benefit of doing something you really and truly love. And if you find out that it's not exactly what you want, don't be afraid to pivot. It's okay. This is the Wild West when you talk about podcasting and anything goes.
Podcast Envy is produced by your podcast boss, Andrea Klunder. That's me. The Podcast Envy theme music is by Valentin Sosnitsky, courtesy of the Free Sound Project at freesound.org, and our podcast Angel music is by Benjamin Mastropolito, also on freesound.org as Lemon Cream. All music is licensed under the Creative Commons. Our episodes are mixed by Edwin Ruiz, and hey, if you want your show to sound as good as ours, hire us. Put the magic audio mojo of the Creative Imposter Studios to work for you. Thanks so much for listening, and here's to making your podcast the envy of everyone else.